They were never meant to be found.
Every grave hides a story.
Some stories should stay buried.
The ridge that refused to stay still. There are places in America that seem to resist being remembered. Not abandoned places. Not ghost towns. Not ruins swallowed by weeds and time. I mean places that feel intentionally absent. Places that somehow avoid becoming part of the world around them. They don't appear in conversations unless someone is forced to mention them. Old county maps disagree about where they begin. Roads near them change names for no reason. Locals lower their voices when they speak about them. Not because they're frightened exactly, but because speaking too loudly feels disrespectful. The Cumberland Plateau held many places like that in the late 1800s. The state of Tennessee treated the plateau almost like a difficult relative. Useful in certain ways, but best visited briefly. The ridges were steep. The valleys held fog long after sunrise. Limestone shelves split through the forest like old bones pushing through skin. Entire sections of woodland remained untouched because nobody wanted to spend more time there than necessary. And somewhere inside those hills, in the autumn of 1877, a surveyor named Croftton Alwell was sent to measure a section of land that refused to stay measured. Before I tell you what happened to him, I want you to imagine the kind of man he was. Croftton was 41 years old that year. Broad shoulders, thick hands, the kind of hands people associated with manual labor before he ever opened his mouth. But when he spoke, he sounded educated in a quiet, practical way. He never rushed his words. He chose them carefully and expected other people to do the same. He grew up in Greene County, Tennessee, the son of a surveyor. While other children learned roads and landmarks, Croftton learned contour lines, elevation changes, creek behavior, and how to estimate distance by eye. His father taught him that maps were never entirely truthful. Paper lies, his father once told him. The land always tells the truth, eventually. Croftton carried that lesson through his entire career. By 1877, he had spent nearly 14 years working under county contracts, measuring terrain throughout eastern Tennessee. It was lonely work. Weeks alone in the wilderness with instruments, notebooks, chains, and compasses. But he liked it. Surveyors are strange people by necessity. Most men walk through forests and see scenery. Surveyors see relationships, distance between ridges, water movement, slope consistency, bearing angles, geological behavior. Croftton trusted numbers more than feelings. That matters, because what happened to him later could not be solved with numbers. In September of 1877, his supervisor in Knoxville assigned him a disputed parcel northwest of a settlement called Harlan's Crossing. The assignment looked ordinary. Two property claims overlapped. County records disagreed with older survey notes. The area had never been formally measured with enough precision to settle ownership. Croftton was told it would take 10 days. He was told that terrain was rough. He was told there was a boarding house in town. He was told the local people kept mostly to themselves. What he was not told was this. Two surveyors had already attempted the same section. One quit. One vanished for nearly 3 days before returning in a condition nobody could clearly explain. And neither completed the work. Croftton arrived in Harlan's Crossing on September 12th. Calling it a town would have been generous. There was a general store with warped floorboards and barrels stacked onto the porch roof. A blacksmith's shed. A mill beside a creek stained dark with tannins. A small church that no longer had a permanent minister because ministers rarely stayed long in isolated plateau settlements. The houses sat scattered rather than organized, as though the people living there preferred distance from one another. The boarding house belonged to a widow named Deline Corey. She was 63 years old and looked carved rather than born. Thin face, iron gray hair pulled tight behind her head, pale eyes that seemed almost colorless in certain light. Deline spoke the way some people chop wood, only when necessary. She showed Croftton his room upstairs. One bed, one wash basin, one north-facing window overlooking the ridge. Breakfast at 6, she said. Supper at 7. Miss either, and you'll eat cold. Then she looked at him for a long moment and added, Stay east of the ridge after the second tree line. Croftton asked why. She answered without expression. Because the west side isn't right. That was all. No explanation. No story. No warning dramatized into folklore. Just a sentence delivered with complete certainty. Croftton spent his first 2 days working the eastern section. The work was familiar. He moved methodically. Transit level. Survey chain. The woods were too quiet. Not silent. Croftton wrote in his notebook. Croftton recorded them carefully. Orrin rubbed his jaw. Another surveyor came through here some years back. County man, too. Didn't finish. Croftton looked up. What happened to him? Orrin glanced toward the line. She continued eating without acknowledging either of them. Came back after being gone a while. Orrin finally said. Looked different somehow. Couldn't explain where he'd been. Left town soon after. Croftton stared at that line for several minutes. Too still. Too cold-looking. He watched it nearly 20 minutes. It never moved. Eventually, he convinced himself it had to belong to a distant cabin or farmhouse. Yet while returning to bed, his mind began performing calculations automatically. The slope angle, the limestone shelves, the terrain grade. There should not have been a structure there. The next morning, Croftton met a man named Silas Derrick. Years later, when historians reviewed Crofton's journals, they found a small asterisk beside the entry describing this meeting. The only asterisk in 14 years of notebooks. Silas Derrick looked like a man Weather had tried to erase. Lean body, old scar along his jaw, hands marked by cuts too precise to belong to ordinary labor. He lived alone north of the settlement. Before that, he'd been a trapper working throughout Tennessee and Kentucky. He stopped trapping in 1866. When Croftton asked why, Silas answered simply, "Didn't care for what I found out there anymore." Croftton asked whether he knew the Western Ridge. Silas became quiet. Then he removed his hat and slowly turned it in his hands. "I know it," he said. Croftton asked if there was anything he should know before surveying that section. Silas looked toward the tree line before answering. "The ground over there doesn't remember itself correctly." Croftton frowned. "Meaning what?" "You'll measure something," Silas said. "Then come back tomorrow, and the distance won't match what you wrote down. Not by much. Just enough to make you think the mistake was yours." Croftton immediately suggested instrument error. Silas shook his head. "I know the difference between bad measuring and bad ground." Then he added something Croftton later underlined twice in his notebook. "Don't stay there after the shadows reach the trees. And if you hear something trying to sound familiar, leave immediately. Don't go looking for it." The following morning, Croftton crossed into the western section. At first, the differences seemed physical. Understandable. The soil was darker. Wood in places that should have been dry. Boots sank slightly rather than striking limestone beneath. The silence was heavier, too. Even ordinary sounds arrived strangely. Water sounded farther away than it should have. Wind through branches carried an odd delay, as though the forest processed sound before releasing it. Still, Croftton continued working, because men like him trust procedure, not intuition. Around noon, he sat beneath a tree to eat. Cornbread, dried meat, cold coffee. While eating, he noticed his survey chain hanging from a nearby branch. It was moving, not swinging, rotating. Each iron link slowly turning against the next, as though an invisible hand twisted the entire chain from within. There was no wind. Croftton watched silently for almost a minute, then removed the chain and packed it away. In his notebook, he wrote, "Chain rotation observed absent environmental cause." Nothing more. Over the next several days, the measurements began changing. Small discrepancies at first. A creek farther from a rock formation than previously recorded. A ridge line drifting slightly north. Bearings shifting by degrees, impossible to explain naturally. Croftton recalibrated his instruments repeatedly. The errors remained, but the terrain itself didn't appear altered. Only the relationships between things changed. That disturbed him more than visible movement would have. One afternoon, deeper within the western trees, he heard the sound. Later, he struggled to describe it. At first, it resembled vibration more than noise. Something felt rather than heard. A low rhythm pressing against the base of his skull. Then slowly it organized itself. Not speech, Not breathing, not wind, but something dangerously close to all three. Imagine hearing a human voice underwater from another room. Familiar shape, wrong texture. Croftton stood completely still. The forest looked normal. Limestone shelves, mountain laurel, dark canopy overhead. Yet the sound continued. And suddenly, he remembered Solace Derek's warning. If you hear something trying to sound familiar, leave. So he did. He walked east toward the ridgeline. The sound stopped abruptly. Not gradually. Abruptly. Like a door slamming shut. That evening, Deline Corey surprised him by speaking first at supper. "You went farther west today," she said. Croftton asked how she knew. "You came back wrong," she answered. He stared at her. "Wrong how?" "Your hands," she said. "You move them when you think. You haven't touched your food once since sitting down." Croftton looked down. She was right. After a long silence, he finally asked what she knew about the ridge. Deline sat quietly for nearly a minute before answering. "My husband went there once in 1861 looking for a missing mule," she said. "He came back the same day, but not entirely." Croftton waited. He remembered things incorrectly after that. Small things. Conversations. Rooms in the house. Windows where there weren't windows. Like his memory had shifted sideways. Did he know he was wrong? "No," she said softly. That was the worst part. That night, Croftton reviewed his notebooks carefully and discovered something deeply unsettling. A limestone formation he described on day 3 did not match the same formation described on day 4. Same label, same location, different physical characteristics. Yet he remembered both entries as accurate when written. He sat at his desk for nearly an hour before adding another note. Extended exposure appears to affect retention. Cross-reference all observations against fixed markers before trust is assigned. For the first time in his professional life, Croftton doubted his own mind. Not dramatically, not emotionally, scientifically. That distinction matters. Fear can be ignored. Uncertainty cannot. He continued surveying for several more days. The light on the western slope appeared every night. Always stationary, always pale. And each day, the measurements drifted farther from reliability. Finally, Croftton returned to Solace Derek's homestead. "Has anyone ever completed a full survey over there?" he asked. Solace split another piece of wood before answering. "Not that I know of." "What exactly happens in that section?" Solace leaned on the axe handle. "Different things for different people. Some lose time. Some lose direction. Some hear voices. Some come back, carrying pieces of the place inside them." Croftton hesitated. Then he mentioned the light. The pale flicker visible from Deline's boarding house. Solace stared at him. "I've lived here 11 years, he said slowly. "I've never seen any light on that ridge." He didn't accuse Croftton of imagining it. That would have been comforting. Instead, he answered carefully, like someone discussing a thing he believed existed but preferred not to acknowledge directly. Croftton packed his equipment that same evening. Before leaving, he asked Deline one final question. "Did your husband ever see the light?" She looked toward the ridge through the kitchen window. "Every night," she said. Then after a pause, "I started seeing it recently myself." Croftton left Harlan's crossing the next morning. The western section remained incomplete. At least that's what he believed. But when he returned to Knoxville and opened his notebook to prepare the official report, he discovered something impossible. 3 additional pages had appeared near the end of the survey journal. Pages written in his handwriting, using his notation system, containing detailed measurements for the remaining Western Territory. Measurements he did not remember taking. He read those pages repeatedly. Technically, they were flawless, perfectly consistent, more precise than his normal work. And somehow that made them worse, because they felt unfamiliar, like excellent imitations. Croftton later wrote that the pages resembled his work the way a reflection resembles a face. Correct in every visible way. Wrong somewhere deeper. Still, he submitted the report. The county accepted it. The property dispute was settled. Life moved forward, but not normally. After Harlan's crossing, Croftton began making measurement errors during ordinary assignments. Minor mistakes, correctable ones, Yet the incorrect measurements always matched the impossible geometry from the western slope, as though part of his mind remained there. His sense of direction also failed at strange moments. East would suddenly feel wrong. Not incorrect exactly, just displaced. The sensation usually lasted minutes before fading, but it never stopped happening. Croftton retired in 1891. He returned to Greene County and spent his remaining years quietly. Neighbors described him as thoughtful, attentive, often distracted by sounds nobody else noticed. In 1894, he gave his nephew Ambrose a wooden box containing every survey notebook from his career. At the bottom sat the small notebook from Harlan's Crossing wrapped in leather cord. "Read the others first," Croftton told him. "What?" Ambrose asked. Croftton looked at him for a long moment. "Because if you don't know how I normally wrote," he said, "you won't understand what's wrong with the final pages." Ambrose later recorded another statement from his uncle almost word for word. Croftton said, "I know those pages are written in my hand. I know they describe measurements I should understand. But I do not believe I made them. Something in that place learned how I recorded things." He paused before continuing. "I think there are places where observation stops belonging entirely to the observer." After Croftton's death, Ambrose showed the notebooks to several specialists. A geologist reviewed the final pages and became disturbed. The terrain described there was geologically consistent, but impossible for that region. The formations belonged nowhere in Tennessee. A historian later uncovered church record from an early settlement near Harlan's Crossing. One passage warned settlers never to build west of certain ridge. The area beyond it carried a name, the inverted country. Nobody explained what the phrase meant. The records simply treated it as understood. Do not build west of the inverted country. That was all. The final detail came decades later. When Ambrose donated the notebooks to a regional archive in 1931, the archivist cataloged every item carefully. She listed the Harlan's Crossing notebook as containing 16 pages. But Croftton's notebook actually held 19. Specifically 19. Because the final 3 pages were the pages he claimed not to remember writing. Ambrose personally recounted them. 19. The archivist counted again in front of him. 16. They stood beside one another at the reading table, looking at the same notebook. Ambrose saw 19 pages. The archivist saw 16. Neither could explain it. The archive burned in 1944. A small fire. Contained quickly. Yet the notebooks were destroyed. Or at least officially destroyed. No fragments survived. No copies. No photographs. Only Ambrose's written recollections remain. Croftton Alwell died in 1903. Cause of death: cardiac failure. Occupation: retired surveyor. Age: 67. According to Ambrose, Croftton never complained about what happened to him, never dramatized it, never called it supernatural. He simply accepted that something from the Western Ridge had followed him home. Years later, Ambrose finally asked whether he regretted taking the assignment. Croftton thought quietly for a while before answering. "No," he said. "Why not?" Croftton looked out the window toward the familiar Tennessee hills. "Because I came back," he answered. Then, after another pause, "Maybe not entirely, but enough." That was the last thing Ambrose ever wrote down from the conversation. And maybe that's the detail that stays with me most. Not the changing measurements, not the impossible pages, not even the light. It's the idea that a place could alter a person so gradually they continue living normally afterward. Working, speaking, growing old, while carrying something inside them that never fully returned. Maybe you've known someone like that. Someone who went somewhere and came back subtly changed. Not traumatized, not broken, just shifted. Or maybe you felt it yourself. Certain places leave impressions. Not mystical ones necessarily. Just deep marks. Old houses. Remote forests. Abandoned roads. A room where something happened years ago that still feels present somehow. Most of us dismiss those feelings because they aren't measurable. But Croftton Alwell spent his life measuring the world. And according to the few records that survived him, the one place he could never properly measure was the place that measured him back. Somewhere beyond the old ridge lines of the Cumberland Plateau, there may still be a section of forest where distances refuse to remain consistent, where sound arrives incorrectly, where east occasionally stops being east. And maybe late at night, if someone stands in the right place and looks toward the western slope long enough, they'll see a pale light between the trees, steady, waiting, as though something there is still taking measurements.